Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 213. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Paul Lamb about his latest novel, Parent Imperfect. Once again, family takes center stage in the sequel to Paul's debut novel, One Match Fire. Parent Imperfect is a story about fatherhood, its highs and lows, joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. In this book, two fathers, Curt and Kelly, are trying to raise their adopted son, Clarkson. Curt is a reluctant father who is coming to terms with being responsible for another person. Kelly, on the other hand, has always wanted a child, but he is plagued by his own demons and suffers from deep depression. And Clarkson, an introverted boy with wonderful artistic abilities, grows up understanding that one of his fathers is absent even when he is present, and the other is absent because his condition prevents him from being present. The result is a surly teenager who feels he doesn't belong and shouldn't be a member of this family. Parent Imperfect takes a look at adoption, the nontraditional family, and the relationship between fathers and sons. In this episode, I'll chat with Paul about his writing journey, how real life works its way into his books, and why he believes the theme of fathers and sons tends to haunt his writing, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Paul Lamb, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Yes, congratulations on making it twice onto the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the follow-up to a book we talked about maybe a year or so ago. That one was called One Match Fire. This new one that you've just come out with is titled Parent Imperfect. So let's start with what the book is about and the inspiration for writing it.
Parent Imperfect is the sequel to One Match Fire, so it involves most of the same characters and the same settings and so forth. However, we say goodbye to one character and we get introduced to a very important character. But the novel itself, it will certainly stand on its own as something to read, is about two fathers, two husbands who are trying to raise their adopted son and all of the troubles that go with being parents in general and adoption as an addition to that, and the fathers being gay. So it's slightly non-traditional family, or in older terms, it would have been. And it is about fathers and sons, much like One Match Fire was.
Let's introduce everyone to the characters for this book, because I want to talk about it for a bit. So let's go through your three main characters, both fathers and the son. We can take them in any particular order you'd like.
Sure. So probably the protagonist of this novel, if it has one, would be the character of Curt. He was Curtis Clark. He's now Curtis Shepard because he took his husband's last name when they married. He is the son of the main character in One Match Fire. He is a pediatrician. He's an accomplished man of empathy and compassion. And he's a husband, and he becomes a father. Not quite all that willingly. He was reluctant to become an adoptive father, but he agrees to do that. And so part of the drama, part of the tension in the novel is him coming to terms with the fact that he is now responsible for another person and he has to step up and do it. His husband is, I would say, the secondary character. His name is Kelly. And I use the name Kelly because it's kind of androgynous and this goes way back, but I was going to try to trick the reader into thinking that maybe Kelly's a woman, but it just got impossible with pronouns and all, so I didn't pursue that anymore. But Kelly is an educated man and a man who has his own demons to struggle with, but they make a good pair because they care about each other deeply. And Kelly is the one who desperately wanted to have a child. And so he convinces Curt to adopt, and they do get a son. It happens that Curt works in the hospital where a lot of unfortunate women have children that they perhaps wouldn't have chosen to have, and so it's made easier for him to find a child to adopt. And what they do is adopt a son. So it continues the theme of fathers and sons from One Match Fire. And the son is named Clarkson Shepherd. And his name is significant because Curt's original name was Clark. So he's a son of the Clark family. Mm-hmm. And this was Kelly's insistence on naming him that to sort of bind the two families, the Clark family and the Shepherd family. Clarkson is a typical boy. He's a little bit introverted. Early on, he shows artistic ability, and one of his canvases are the walls of their home where he's drawing with his crayons. And of course, he does all the usual stuff. But one of the things that recurs is an orange dog that he draws a lot of. And that proves to be very significant later in the story. But the other thing is he draws horizontal lines, parallel horizontal lines, all the way up the side of the walls. Sometimes he does it in rainbows, sometimes it's in brown. He can't explain why they're important to him, but he continues to do it. And it's not so troubling to his parents and his grandparents, but it's something they thought they should pay attention to and just watch. He grows into a surly adolescent, and along the way, he is perceptive enough to realize that Curt, his father Curt, doesn't really love him the way a father should. He sees the hesitation in Curt, and he recognizes it, and he's resentful about that. His other father, Kelly, struggles with his demons. He has major depressive disorder, and he has whole days where he's lost completely. He can't get out of bed. And although Kelly realizes he has to be the anchor for the family, it's hard for him to do that when he's, in bed with the covers pulled over his head and he can't get up for days. So poor Clarkson sees one father who's absent even when he's present, and another who's absent because he can't be present. And he feels like he's a mistake. He shouldn't have been adopted by this family, and he's not loved there. And so he begins to act out. And that's the culmination of the novel when he steals the car, even though he's underage, and drives 3 hours on the highway to the family cabin and then vandalizes it terribly, except it makes perfect sense to him. It makes perfect sense to a 15-year-old boy who's subject to magical thinking. And so there's a confrontation at the end. I won't tell you how it's resolved, but there is a possibility that things will work out in the end.
Let's draw some connections between this book and the first one, One Match Fire, because you mentioned this is the sequel. So we see the main character, Curt. He has grown up now.
Yes.
So there's a leap in time between the first book and the second. Did you always suspect, if not suspect that that character would continue on with his story when you were back writing and planning book one?
No, is the short answer. The longer answer is I have a son who's a doctor and he's a pediatric oncologist. So I have some familiarity with this field. So I knew the character could continue to have a life. I, just as with One Match Fire, I didn't set out to write a novel. I was just writing short stories that seemed to be connected with the same characters or going to this cabin they have. And I was accumulating these stories until I realized, well, there's another novel here. So with Curt, I knew him, I knew the character well. So I knew what, if I threw him into this situation or that, how he would react. And it made for a good writing of the story. But no, I did not intend to continue his story deliberately.
So when you accumulated enough vignettes, let's say, to
Yes.
make a novel, what was the tipping point for you? At what point did you decide, okay, I've seen enough of this relationship, these characters to understand that it's worth, building a novel around it? What was that tipping point?
A lot of writers talk about how their characters take over the narrative and take it in directions that were never seen in advance. And that's pretty much what happened here. I had these vignettes and short stories and these characters well in my mind, and they started doing things that I never anticipated. They would, if I had done a character sketch, that would have been in the sketch. If I'd written an outline, it some of those acts would never have been in the outline. The characters were coming alive in my head. That's how you say it metaphorically, I guess. And I knew that I had to tell their story, and I knew then that it was going to be a novel.
You tend to draw from real life, not just for your characters, but for sort of all aspects of your story. How much do you draw from people you know, situations you have experienced, things that you have witnessed or heard? How much of that makes it into your book, and how much of it is just sort of maybe background noise or maybe lightly colors what you decide to write?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the hardest one first and refer to it as light coloring, even though it isn't. And that's the fact that the two fathers are gay, and I am not. Statistically, I'm sure I know several gay men, but I can't identify them as such. So what I was doing was creating these characters that did not have experience in my life. And I was worried about that. I was worried about appropriating someone else's culture or not doing it fairly, not doing it justice, that kind of thing. But really, the story, the relationship between Curt and Kelly is about a long-term, committed, monogamous relationship. And I do know about that. So I wrote these characters that way. And I just wanted them to be normal people who happen to be gay. So that's, in that sense, it's background noise that filtered in and became part of the story. I, of course, have a son who's a pediatrician, so I know a little bit about that. The Kelly character is deeply troubled by his past, his childhood, and has developed major depressive disorder. And he's resistant to being treated for it because he thinks he's in control, because he's afraid that if he gets a diagnosis, it'll be a stigma that'll follow him through his life, because he doesn't want to appear to be weak. But it does trouble him. And I have major depressive disorder. I know what he is going through. I've never had episodes as severe as the ones depicted in the novel, but similar, close. And I can write about that with authority, without appropriating, with authenticity. So that is part of my life. The son Clarkson, he's made of whole cloth. I can't say that I've experienced being adopted or raised any adopted children. I think he's a typical kid till he grows up and becomes a typical adolescent. And he's artsy, which I would guess is from me. But he's also much more clever than I think I was at that age. So he's a creation out of thin air. But once again, the setting is pretty much my own cabin in the woods. They have the cabin that they go to, and they solve their personal problems there and relax with each other. And I have that cabin, and it is a great place to sit and relax and stare into the fire and talk about anything or nothing. So that's all from my life. Now, I set the story in St. Louis, although I live in Kansas City. because I grew up in St. Louis. And so I can touch on some of the familiar landmarks there and reference them. Curt's parents live on a little street in a town called Richmond Heights, and that's the street where I lived on. And the house they live in is directly across the street from the one I grew up in. So that comes out of my life experience too. But then Curt and Kelly, when they get married, buy a condo in the Central West End, which is kind of an artsy, upper class area. It's where Tennessee Williams lived and T.S. Eliot and several other famous people. So I don't have that experience. I would prowl those neighborhoods and go to the restaurants and bars there and such, but I pretty much just made out of thin air.
When you have friends and family read the book, people who are familiar with you and your family and people you know, do any of them ever comment on the characters, themes, feeling familiar, conversations sounding like ones they remember? Do you ever get people saying, "Hey, I think that's me"?
That has never happened to me.
No?
No. Um, there are certainly bits in both of the novels that are deliberately people I know who have said things or done things, and so I said I've got to put them in a novel, but they've not recognized themselves.
Oh, well done then.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, let's go back to the setting, particularly this cabin in the woods, which you have carried through from the first book into the second. You've been writing about this cabin now for a long time. And as you said, it's very much based on your own cabin in the woods.
Yes.
The more you write about it, does it change in your mind? Or does it just become more firmly entrenched as it was when you first decided to write about it? I'm curious if it has morphed as much as your characters develop and grow. Do you find that either the feel of the cabin or the look of the cabin, anything changes about it the more you write about it?
That's a good question. At first, I would say no, that it's my cabin, it's not theirs, and it's my experience. But in the novel, there are several times when it's stressed to Kelly or to Clarkson, who are newcomers to the cabin, that you need to make this your place. Find out the things you appreciate about this and you want to come back and experience and so forth. So, in that sense, it has changed. But in a more literal sense, now my grandchildren are coming to the cabin. And one of the great things they do there is spread marbles in the gravel. I have a gravel around the cabin, to keep the fire away and keep the scrubby plants from throwing bugs on our legs and all of that. So this gray gravel is filled with thousands of colorful marbles, and I love it. It's a bit of whimsy, it's a bit of color across the gray expanse, and it's something the kids delight in doing. And yeah, I always tell them Grandpa wants marbles for his birthday, so we can take them out to the cabin and spread them around. And this is something that the Clarkson character does.
Mm.
It's part of his magical thinking. He thinks if he arranges the marbles this way and that good things will happen to him. And of course, he's a child, and I don't think any of my grands are doing for that reason. But that is an evolution of my experience of my cabin with having the grandkids there. Now, last summer, when most of my family was there with me, a couple of my son and my son-in-law set up a zip line between the trees, and boy, was that a big hit with the kids. I didn't get on it, of course, but that goes exactly to what I was saying about how the characters have to find what they appreciate about the cabin. And the zip line is something new now. They took it down, so now I'll have to put it up myself, and that'll be a disaster. But I'm taking two of my grandkids out there next week, and they're already talking about the zip line. So wow.
Right. So it's a new
But
tradition, one you didn't
yes, it is.
necessarily think about starting. Okay.
Also, and something I didn't put in either of the novels is a family of beavers have moved into my lake, and they're taking down all my oak trees, which is just so delightful, isn't it? And I don't put that in because it's just one more dynamic thing that I don't want to have to develop. But
Yeah.
there's an evolution of my cabin experience is looking at all my white oaks gone. And I say that that's excessive. That I have 80 acres of forest, and they're harvesting trees around the edge of the lake, which is only 2.5 acres in size. So I exaggerate. But my experience evolves.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I don't, hopefully it's not too much of a spoiler, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the vandalism.
Yes.
How difficult was it to write about that and put that in the story? Because this cabin, for all intents and purposes, is one of your characters,
Yes, it is. Yeah.
continuing character throughout all these stories. How difficult was it to harm your character?
Not at all, actually, because it came out of the character.
Mm,
As I said before, if I had plotted the story, the vandalism would never have occurred. But as I let the character have free reign, he did this. Clarkson is the character involved. He vandalizes the cabin in a way that makes sense to him.
mm.
And it goes back to those horizontal lines he's drawing on the walls of his house and how, well, I don't want to reveal his revelation, but it feeds from that. And that was unplanned, but it made perfect sense within the character. And so once I had that understanding, it was easy to write. I knew what he was doing and why. And so I had to do it and do it justice to him. And the vandalism doesn't destroy the cabin in any way.
Oh, good. So you don't kill off your
No, no,
your
I do
recurring
not.
character.
No. Character just gets adorned a little.
Gotcha. Throughout these books and these stories, you talk about fatherhood and relationships in even a broader sense, not just the father son relationship, but the relationship people have to others, contemporaries, friends, also to the cabin, the wilderness, the world at large. But kind of coupled with that, it seems, is this idea about people having secrets or keeping part of themselves back. The idea that you never really fully know someone, even someone you love and cherish. Is that something you intentionally set out to do and to kind of explore in your stories, or does it just creep in? Do you just discover it after you start writing it?
I would say more the latter,
Mm,
that it does more creep in, but it's certainly great for character development and plot to have secrets. So, I would probably go into it saying, what secret am I going to discover or reveal? And then it comes from character. So the Curt character is the buttoned down pediatrician. Everything's in order. All the pencils in his desk are straight. And his husband Kelly is a slob and the house is a mess. And Curt is not happy about that, but he knows he can't be too harsh with his husband. So he keeps that a secret, that he doesn't like living the messy life. And he confesses that secret to his mother, and she hits him hard with a revelation about how that's not important, and here's what is important. But he keeps his secret. And the boy Clarkson is resentful of his father and sort of dismissive of his other father. And he's adopted. He doesn't feel like he belongs. He doesn't feel loved. And but he has an artistic talent which they're trying to nurture. And a very profound thing happens at his eighth grade art fair when his birth mother shows up. And of course, she's not supposed to see him until he's 18 and all of that, but she can't stop herself. And he understands who she is. And Curt, his father, didn't show up to the art fair because he had things to do at the hospital that he couldn't get out of. So he's very resentful that this mother who didn't know him for 15 years shows up and his own father didn't. And that creates a huge rift. And that confirms in him he needs to keep himself closed off from Curt.
mm-hmm.
That this man is not a factor in my life. And he doesn't choose to be, and I don't choose to have him that way. So I think it's part of the human dynamic that we always hold back something. And even when we think we understand another person, we don't, not fully. And I think I said in One Match Fire, where in the journals that the old grandfather was keeping, there was a reference to somebody named KD, and we never find out who KD is. And the point of that was to say, as much as we know someone, we'll never know all their secrets. And I think that's the case here. Although Curt finds out in the end that he's got to reveal some of himself. He has to let go of some of his secrets.
Yeah. Well, you keep writing about fathers and sons. So I'm curious, in exploring this theme over and over again, do you find yourself getting answers to questions you may have about that? Or does it just simply raise more questions and thoughts and things to ponder? Like the more you write about it, do you find more resolution or just more questions?
I think it's more questions,
Yeah.
more mystery. I did not have a close relationship with my own father, and I set out to have a good relationship with my own sons and my daughter because of that. And I think that's why the idea of fathers and sons haunts my writing, because I'm trying to do all that exploration. And if not find answers, at least find perspectives. Here's how some fathers work, and here's how some don't. And here's my ideal, and here's an example of something that's not ideal. And maybe all of that can work out in the end if the spirit is willing. But yeah, fathers and sons is a theme. It's part of my DNA. I don't know that I want to probe it too deeply.
It certainly makes for good stories. I mean, you've
Yes, I think
certainly
so.
tapped this well, which sounds like it's probably you're probably never going to hit the bottom of it.
Well, I would like to write something other than about this family.
Well, let's
I
talk about that. Let's talk about that. Do you have plans for more books featuring this family? Is there a
yes,
third in the works?
there's a third and a fourth in the
Oh, okay.
works, and
Okay.
I have a novel. It's a short novel. It's only like 57,000 words, but it's from Kelly's perspective, and it's not really a prequel or a sequel to these novels. I say that it's adjacent to these novels, and it does involve some of the characters, but it's more a deep dive into Kelly's formation. And then, because several people told me I should, I've written a very long novel about Kathy, the character Kathy, who is Curt's mother, pretty much following her from birth to death. And that's right now about 180,000 words. So that's too many words. And I'll have to cut that way back. But even so, I've said to myself, you need to write something else than just about this family. So tried writing some short stories and that worked, and they were published. But it turned out they were stories about these characters in different settings.
Hmm.
So there they are again. So I don't want to be ungrateful for having this great subject, but I want to expand beyond it as well. I don't know that I'll ever be done with them, and maybe that's not a bad thing, but I'd like to do some other things as well.
Okay. Do you find that there is something that's very easy to write? Have one of these, have any aspect of these novels been very easy for you to write versus maybe an aspect that's been incredibly challenging? Can you pinpoint anything like that?
I know the characters very well.
Mm.
I know how they would react to certain situations, so I can write those situations easily. And easy as in first draft writing. Then there's all the edits and the second and third and 50th draft,
Hmm.
which isn't as easy. But because I know these characters well, I know what to do with them. Now, part of the problem I'm finding with these short stories I'm working on is that I seem to have a setting or a scene, but I don't have a whole story. And that's hard work, trying to tease a story out of something. I have a story in mind where Curt goes to his high school reunion, 20-year high school reunion, and all kinds of great things could happen there, meeting up with old friends and meeting up with old enemies and that kind of thing. But what do they talk about? And what is his conclusion at the end of the night? I don't have that part of that story worked out. I have another story where the Kathy character is picking up nickels and dimes off the street because she and her husband are so very poor, and even that will help their budget. But what's the story in that? I can show her picking up the money and thinking about it and washing it when she gets home and that kind of thing. But the hard part is putting that all within a story. So I have the character, but some of the time I don't know the story. And there's where the hard work is.
Mm. And do you find that that's how these novels get created? These vignettes become short stories. The short stories then are stitched together into a longer. Is that how you tend to finish a novel?
That is how these first two novels, One Match Fire and Parent Imperfect, came together. Yeah, they started out as short stories that I was accumulating. Now, the next two are continuous narratives that are not short stories. That's a big job. They say short stories are harder to write than novels because you're so confined in your space. But I think I'm stronger in the short story arena, honestly. Mm. So I'll just sit down and keep writing.
Right, right. Well, if people want to learn more about you and these novels and look for the new releases when they're out, where can they go to find you and that information?
The best place is my webpage, paullamwriter.com. That links to my social media, to my blog. It gives a list of all my published stories and interviews such as this one with links so that people can hear my dulcet tones.
Excellent. And if people want to purchase a copy of Parent Imperfect, your new one, or the first book, One Match Fire, where can they go to buy it?
There are all sorts of outlets. If you go to Blue Cedar Press, my publisher, and buy it directly from them, I get an extra nickel or two out of it, I think. But it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and any bookstore in the country can order it for a reader. So it's easily available.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, I want to thank you again for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with Parent Imperfect and the other two novels you're working on with these characters. We will look forward to those in the hopefully near future. And congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.